"Open the door, ma'am. We have a warrant." The voice cut through the thin wood like cold steel, sharp, controlled, and already certain it would be obeyed. Naomi Carter didn't move at first. She stood in the dim glow of her apartment's hallway light, the hum of an old refrigerator filling the silence behind her, her breath slow, measured, deliberate. The knocking came again, louder this time, not frantic but absolute, the kind that didn't ask for permission, only announced inevitability. Outside, red and blue lights washed over the narrow street, reflecting off parked cars and flickering through her curtains in restless pulses, painting her living room walls in colors that didn't belong there. She glanced toward the bedroom, where her mother rested behind a half-closed door, the soft rise and fall of her breathing barely visible in the shadow. "Stay inside," Naomi whispered, her voice low but steady, the kind of calm that didn't come from ignorance, but from knowing exactly what was at stake. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Another knock followed, accompanied by the faint crackle of a radio, voices overlapping outside, measured, coordinated, efficient. Naomi stepped forward, her bare feet silent against the worn hardwood floor, each step grounded, unhurried, as though time had slowed just for her. She reached the front door, but didn't touch the handle. Instead, her eyes shifted upward, past the doorframe, to the small section of wall just to the right, where a single frame hung, simple, unassuming, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. The knocking stopped. For a brief moment, everything outside went still, as if the world had paused between breaths. Then came the sound of boots repositioning on concrete, the faint scrape of metal against metal, and the quiet click of something being prepared. Naomi exhaled slowly, her hand hovering inches from the door, not trembling, not hesitant, just waiting. "You're making a mistake," she said, not loudly, not defiantly, but with a clarity that carried through the wood and into the night beyond. There was no response at first, only the low murmur of communication, the kind exchanged when people believe they already understand the situation. Naomi closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, centering herself, grounding in the quiet truth she carried while everything outside moved with blind certainty. The hallway light flickered once, briefly dimming before returning to its soft amber glow, and in that moment, her reflection appeared faintly in the glass of the frame on the wall, a mirror of stillness in a storm already set in motion. She opened her eyes again, steady, present, aware. Whatever was about to happen had already begun long before this knock, long before tonight, long before they decided to come here with numbers and authority. And yet, standing there in the narrow space between silence and intrusion, Naomi Carter didn't look afraid. She looked ready. Naomi's hand finally lowered from the air, but she still did not reach for the handle. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze drifting back down the narrow hallway toward the bedroom door, where the faint outline of her mother remained still beneath a thin blanket. The apartment smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, a quiet blend of care and survival, the kind that lingered in spaces where time moved differently, where nights stretched longer than days. Naomi took one slow step backward, then another, creating distance between herself and the door, not out of fear, but out of intention. Her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of a small wooden table by the wall, where a folded stack of medical bills sat beside a worn ceramic mug. Everything in the room told a story of quiet endurance, of doing what needed to be done without asking for recognition. Outside, the low murmur of voices sharpened into clearer fragments. "Unit 3, hold position. Copy that." The rhythm was practiced, efficient, almost routine. Naomi tilted her head slightly, listening, not to the words, but to the tone beneath them. There was no hesitation out there. No doubt. Whoever had sent them believed this was necessary. That belief, she knew, was more dangerous than anger. She moved again, this time toward the living room, where the faint glow of the streetlights filtered through the blinds, casting long horizontal shadows across the walls. Dust particles floated in the air, catching the light in slow, drifting patterns, as if time itself had thickened. Her eyes returned once more to the frame on the wall. It was not large, not ornate. Just a simple black border surrounding a piece of identification that most people would not recognize at a glance. The seal in the corner was small, understated, but official. The name beneath it was hers, printed in clean, precise lettering. Naomi Carter. She studied it for a moment, not with pride, not even with attachment, but with clarity. That part of her life had always existed in the background, quiet, deliberate, unseen by those who never thought to look closer. The knocking came again, this time accompanied by a firm voice. "Ma'am, we are coming in." The statement hung in the air, final, unambiguous. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with the same steady calm. She walked back toward the door, each step measured, grounded, her posture straight but relaxed, as though she were entering a conversation rather than a confrontation. The hardwood floor creaked softly beneath her weight, a familiar sound that seemed louder now in the silence between each breath. When she reached the door, she placed her palm flat against its surface, feeling the faint vibration from the movement on the other side. So many people, so certain. She leaned slightly closer, her voice calm, even, carrying through the barrier without force. "Before you do anything else," she said, "read the warrant again." There was a pause. Not long, not dramatic, but real. A subtle disruption in the flow outside, like a ripple across still water. Papers shifted. Someone cleared their throat. Another voice, quieter, responded, "It checks out." Naomi's expression did not change. She lowered her hand from the door and stepped back once more, giving them space they had already decided to take. The apartment seemed to settle around her, every object in its place, every shadow exactly where it belonged. In that moment, the difference between what they believed and what was true became the only thing that mattered. And Naomi Carter stood in the center of it, composed, unshaken, waiting for the inevitable to unfold exactly as it was meant to. The door gave way with a sharp, final sound that echoed through the apartment like a line being crossed, and suddenly the quiet space Naomi had held together with routine and care was filled with movement, uniforms, and the controlled urgency of people executing a decision already made. Boots stepped onto the worn hardwood floor, measured and coordinated, radios murmuring low at their shoulders, beams of white light sweeping across walls that had never asked to be examined. Naomi did not step back further. She stood where she was, hands visible, shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady as it met the first officer who entered. He did not look at her long. His attention moved past her, scanning, assessing, following a checklist that had nothing to do with who she actually was. "Stay where you are, ma'am," he said, his tone firm but not raised, as if reading from something practiced. Naomi gave a small nod, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, the kind that said she understood the process better than they realized. More officers moved through the apartment, spreading into rooms with quiet efficiency, opening doors, checking corners, their presence filling every inch of space. The living room felt smaller now, the air thinner, the hum of the refrigerator drowned beneath the layered sound of communication and motion. From the hallway, one of them paused near the bedroom door. Naomi's eyes shifted immediately. "She is resting," Naomi said, her voice calm but precise, each word placed carefully. "She is not part of this." The officer hesitated for half a second, then pushed the door open just enough to look inside before closing it again. "Clear," he said into his radio. Naomi exhaled quietly, not relief, but confirmation that at least one boundary had held. At the center of it all, just inside the doorway, stood a man who had not moved as much as the others. Chief Richard Hayes. His presence did not need to be announced. It was in the way the others adjusted around him, the way their voices lowered slightly when he spoke, the way decisions seemed to settle when he simply looked in a direction. He held a folded document in one hand, the warrant, its edges slightly creased, his thumb resting along the margin as though the paper itself carried authority. His eyes moved across the room slowly, not hurried, not uncertain, but not careless either. He was not searching randomly. He was confirming what he already believed. Naomi studied him the same way, her gaze steady, measuring something deeper than rank or posture. "You are certain about this," she said, not as a question, but as a statement shaped like one. Hayes finally looked directly at her, his expression composed, controlled, the kind that had been built over years of command. "We follow procedure," he replied, his voice even, grounded in confidence that came from repetition. Naomi's lips pressed together briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition. "Procedure only works," she said softly, "when the foundation is correct." A faint shift passed through the room. Not enough to stop anything, but enough to be felt. Hayes did not respond immediately. His gaze drifted past her shoulder, toward the interior of the apartment, taking in the small details, the medical supplies neatly arranged on a side table, the stack of documents, the quiet signs of a life built on responsibility rather than secrecy. Still, none of it interrupted the path he had already committed to. "Continue," he said to his team, his voice carrying just enough weight to move things forward again. Officers resumed their methodical search, opening drawers, checking surfaces, their movements precise but impersonal. One of them stepped into the living room fully now, his eyes landing briefly on the wall where the frame hung. He did not stop. He moved on, his attention pulled elsewhere, the detail dismissed in a glance. Naomi followed that movement with her eyes, then slowly looked back at Hayes. The distance between belief and truth was narrowing, but not yet broken. And as the room filled with quiet certainty on one side and silent clarity on the other, the moment balanced on something fragile, waiting for the smallest shift to reveal everything. A drawer slid open with a soft, wooden scrape, followed by the quiet shuffle of items being moved, examined, and set aside without care for their meaning. Papers that had once been stacked with intention were now separated, edges misaligned, their order broken by hands that saw them only as possible evidence, not as fragments of a life. Naomi watched without reacting, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, but her eyes tracked everything. Not in resistance, not in panic, but in awareness. Every movement in the room mattered, even the ones that seemed small. One officer paused near the kitchen counter, lifting a small flash drive from beside the coffee maker. It was plain, unmarked, something that could belong to anyone. He turned it between his fingers, then raised it slightly. "Got something," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried. Several heads turned, including Hayes. The officer stepped closer, extending the device toward him. Hayes took it without hurry, his fingers closing around it with a quiet certainty, as though this small object confirmed something he had already decided. He glanced at Naomi, just briefly, measuring her reaction. She did not give him one. No tension, no denial, just stillness. "Where did you find this?" Hayes asked. "Kitchen counter," the officer replied. Hayes nodded once, his attention returning to the device, then back to the room. The atmosphere shifted, subtle but real, like a current changing direction beneath the surface. "Secure it," he said, handing it back. The officer moved away, already treating it as significant. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze resting on Hayes now, not challenging, not defensive, but precise. "You are building a story," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the layered sounds without force. "But you have not checked if it is true." Hayes did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened just enough to be noticed, a flicker of irritation or perhaps something closer to doubt, though it did not fully form. "We follow what we find," he replied, his tone measured, controlled. Naomi's expression softened, not in agreement, but in understanding. "And sometimes," she said, "what you find is placed exactly where you expect it to be." The words hung there, not dramatic, not loud, but deliberate. For a moment, no one spoke. The room continued its quiet activity, but something beneath it had shifted again. Hayes looked at her longer this time, studying not just her words, but the way she held them, the absence of fear in her posture, the calm that did not match the situation he believed he was in. It did not fit. And yet, he pushed that thought aside, returning to the structure he trusted. "Keep moving," he said to his team, his voice firmer now, reinforcing momentum. An officer moved past Naomi, stepping closer to the wall where the frame hung. His flashlight beam passed over it briefly, illuminating the glass surface, catching a reflection before moving on. He did not stop, did not read it. The light moved away, leaving the frame in shadow again. Naomi's eyes followed that beam for a fraction of a second, then returned to Hayes. "You still have time," she said, her voice lower now, almost a warning wrapped in patience. "Look carefully." Hayes exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath, the kind that resets focus. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the room again, slower this time, more deliberate. Not searching for confirmation, but noticing. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of a wall clock, the quiet order of a life that did not match the disruption inside it. His eyes moved past Naomi, past the scattered papers, past the officers, and for the first time, they lingered, just for a second, on the wall behind her. The frame was still there, unchanged, waiting. Not hidden, not protected, just present. And something about that stillness, that lack of concealment, began to press against the certainty he had carried into the room. Not enough to stop him. Not yet. But enough to slow the next step. Enough to make the moment stretch just a little longer than it should have. The room no longer moved as quickly as it had moments before, but it had not stopped either, caught somewhere between certainty and hesitation, between action and something quieter that no one had named yet. An officer near the doorway adjusted his grip on the radio at his shoulder, his voice lower now as he relayed updates that sounded less confident than before, though the words themselves had not changed. Another officer closed a cabinet with a softer motion than he had opened it, as if the force he had entered with no longer matched the atmosphere inside the apartment. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her presence steady, almost anchoring the space while everything else shifted around her. Her eyes did not follow every movement now. Instead, they stayed on Hayes, watching the way his posture had changed just slightly, the way his shoulders no longer leaned forward with momentum but held a fraction of restraint. He still held authority, still carried command, but something underneath it had begun to loosen, just enough to be felt. Hayes took a slow step deeper into the living room, his shoes pressing quietly against the floor, his gaze moving again, this time not searching for confirmation, but observing. The stack of medical supplies on the table. The pill organizer labeled carefully by day. The framed photograph of Naomi and an older woman, both smiling, both unaware of the moment now unfolding around them. None of it aligned with what he had expected. None of it supported the version of reality he had walked in with. Yet the warrant remained in his hand, its presence a constant reminder of the decision already made. "Chief," one of the officers called from near the kitchen, his tone cautious now, not urgent. "We are not finding anything else." The words landed heavier than they should have, not because of what they said, but because of what they implied. Hayes did not respond immediately. His thumb pressed lightly against the edge of the paper in his hand, feeling its weight, its authority, its flaw. Naomi took a small breath, barely visible, but enough to mark the shift. "You built your conclusion before you walked in," she said quietly, her voice calm but unmistakably clear. "Now you are trying to make the room match it." Hayes looked at her again, longer this time, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in anger, but in concentration, as if he were finally allowing himself to question the structure he had relied on. "We have evidence," he said, though the words did not carry the same certainty they had before. Naomi's gaze flicked briefly toward the kitchen, toward where the small flash drive had been found, then back to him. "You have something that looks like evidence," she corrected, her tone still even, still controlled. "That is not the same thing." Silence followed, not forced, not dramatic, but natural, settling into the space like dust after movement. An officer near the wall shifted his weight, his eyes drifting once more toward the frame that had been ignored again and again. This time he paused, just for a second longer than before. The beam of his flashlight returned, slower now, less dismissive, the light catching the glass, reflecting a faint image back at him. He leaned in slightly, not fully committing, but no longer passing it by. Hayes noticed the change. His gaze followed the line of the light, moving from the officer to the wall, then to the frame itself. The distance between them was only a few steps, but it felt longer now, stretched by everything that had happened in the room. Naomi did not turn to look. She already knew where his attention had gone. "You still have time," she said again, softer now, not as a warning, but as an invitation to see what had been there all along. Hayes took one step forward, then another, the warrant still in his hand, his focus narrowing, the rest of the room fading into the background as he approached the wall. The officers did not speak. They watched, their movements slowing, their certainty thinning with each second that passed. The apartment grew quiet, not empty, but suspended, as if every object, every breath, every thought was waiting for the same moment to arrive. And for the first time since he had entered, Chief Richard Hayes did not look like a man executing a plan. He looked like a man about to discover whether that plan had been wrong all along. Hayes stopped just a few feet from the wall, the distance close enough now that the frame was no longer just part of the room but the center of it, drawing his attention with a quiet gravity that did not demand, but waited. The rest of the apartment seemed to fall away behind him. The soft murmur of radios lowering, the subtle movements of officers slowing as if instinctively aware that something had shifted beyond routine. The beam of light from the officer beside him steadied on the glass, no longer sweeping past, no longer dismissing what it revealed. Hayes did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he stood there, eyes fixed, allowing himself for the first time to actually read what had been in front of him all along. The seal in the corner caught the light first, small but unmistakable, the kind of mark that did not belong in ordinary spaces. His gaze moved downward, slower now, tracing the clean lines of printed text, each word landing with a weight that pressed against the certainty he had carried into the room. Naomi Carter. The name he already knew. But beneath it, the designation followed, precise, official, impossible to misinterpret. Federal Internal Affairs Oversight. The words did not raise their voice. They did not need to. They simply existed, clear and undeniable, and in that clarity, everything else began to unravel. Hayes felt it before he showed it, a subtle shift in his breath, a pause that lingered half a second longer than control would allow. His grip on the warrant loosened slightly, the paper no longer feeling like authority, but like something incomplete, something that had failed to carry the full truth. Behind him, the officers sensed it too. No one spoke. No one moved. The room had gone still in a way that was different from before, not tense, not chaotic, but suspended, as if every person present understood that the meaning of this moment extended beyond the walls they stood within. Naomi remained where she had always been, her posture unchanged, her gaze calm, watching not the discovery itself, but the man experiencing it. She did not step forward. She did not explain. She allowed the silence to do what words never could. Hayes blinked once, slowly, his eyes moving again across the identification as if confirming that it would not change, that the truth would remain no matter how many times he looked. His shoulders, once squared with command, softened just enough to reveal the weight settling onto them. The structure he had trusted, the process he had followed, the conclusion he had acted on, all of it now stood in question, not because it had been challenged, but because it had been incomplete from the start. He inhaled quietly, a controlled breath, but it did not restore what had been lost. It only made him aware of it. His gaze shifted, not away, but outward, taking in the apartment again with new understanding. The medical supplies, the quiet order, the absence of concealment. It all aligned now, but not with the narrative he had brought inside. It aligned with her. Naomi's voice came then, not loud, not sharp, but steady, filling the silence with something grounded. "Now you see it," she said, her tone neither accusing nor triumphant, but simply true. Hayes did not respond right away. He could not. The words he had used earlier, the certainty he had spoken with, no longer fit the moment. Instead, he lowered his hand slowly, the warrant folding slightly as his grip relaxed, the paper no longer leading the situation, no longer defining it. The officer beside him shifted his weight, his flashlight dipping slightly, the beam no longer searching but holding. Outside, the distant flicker of emergency lights continued to pulse through the windows, but inside, the energy had changed completely. What had entered as force now stood as realization. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, the line between authority and accountability became visible, drawn not by argument, but by truth that had been waiting in plain sight the entire time. No one spoke for several seconds, but the silence was no longer empty. It carried weight now, thick and undeniable, settling into every corner of the apartment like something that could not be ignored once seen. Hayes lowered his gaze from the frame, but not out of dismissal. This time, it was different. It was the kind of movement that followed recognition, not authority. His hand, still holding the warrant, shifted slightly, the paper folding against itself as though it had lost its structure along with his certainty. Behind him, The officers stood in a quiet formation that no longer felt coordinated. It felt uncertain. Radios remained silent. No new instructions came. For the first time since they entered, no one seemed sure what the next step was supposed to be. Naomi did not move. She did not step forward to claim control of the moment, nor did she step back. She simply remained present, her calm now contrasting even more sharply with the shift that had taken over the room. Her eyes stayed on Hayes, not with challenge, not with judgment, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. Hayes turned slowly, his attention returning to her, but the way he looked at her had changed. The confidence that once framed his expression was no longer rigid. It had softened, replaced by something more complicated, something that required acknowledgement rather than command. "Why did you not say it earlier?" he asked, his voice quieter now, not weakened, but stripped of its earlier certainty. Naomi held his gaze without hesitation. "Because you were not listening for it," she replied, her tone even, grounded. "You were listening for confirmation." The words landed with precision, not sharp, but exact. Hayes exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a controlled release, but it did not restore his previous posture. Instead, it seemed to settle him into the reality now standing in front of him. He glanced briefly toward the officers, then back to Naomi, the weight of the situation becoming clearer with each passing second. "We had a report," he said, though the statement felt incomplete as soon as it left him. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the process without validating the conclusion. "You had a report," she said, "but you did not verify who it was about." The distinction hung in the air, simple but critical. One of the officers shifted near the kitchen, his gaze moving toward Hayes as if waiting for direction, but none came. The chain of command had not broken, but it had paused, suspended by something more powerful than instruction. Hayes took a step back from the wall, creating distance between himself and the frame, but not from what it represented. His eyes moved across the apartment again, but this time with a different lens. The details he had overlooked before now stood out with clarity. The organization, the care, the absence of concealment. It was all consistent, not with guilt, but with responsibility. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of the gap between what had been assumed and what was real. Naomi watched him process it, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. "The device you found," she said, her voice calm but deliberate, drawing his attention back to the small detail that had shifted the room earlier. Hayes looked at her, waiting. "It was meant to be found," she continued, "just not by you." The words landed differently this time, not as a warning, not as a challenge, but as a piece of something larger. Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought, connecting pieces that had not made sense before. The room remained still, every officer now fully aware that they were no longer in control of the narrative they had walked into. Naomi took a slow breath, her posture unchanged, her voice steady. "You came here believing you were executing an operation," she said, "but you stepped into one that was already in progress." The meaning settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable. Hayes did not respond immediately. He did not deny it. He did not challenge it. For the first time, he stood without the shield of certainty, facing a truth that had not been hidden, only overlooked. And in that moment, the balance of power did not shift loudly. It shifted silently, completely, and without the need for force. The words settled into the room like a quiet shift in gravity, subtle but impossible to ignore, and for a moment no one moved because movement itself no longer felt certain, no longer felt justified without understanding what had just been revealed. Hayes stood facing Naomi, the space between them unchanged in distance but entirely different in meaning, his posture no longer leading the room but existing within it, as if he had stepped out of the role he carried and into something more exposed, more accountable. He glanced toward the officer holding the small flash drive, his eyes sharper now, not with authority, but with focus that had finally turned inward. "Bring that here," he said, his voice steady, but no longer absolute. The officer hesitated for the briefest second before stepping forward, placing the device into Hayes's hand. It looked smaller now, almost insignificant compared to the weight it had carried just minutes earlier. Hayes turned it over once, then again, as if expecting it to reveal something new under closer inspection, but the object itself did not change. Only the context around it had. Naomi watched him, her expression calm, her presence unchanged, allowing him the space to arrive at the conclusion himself rather than forcing it upon him. "You assumed it belonged to me," she said quietly, her tone not accusatory, but precise. Hayes looked up at her, the connection forming more clearly now. "It does not," he said, though the words sounded less like a statement and more like a realization spoken aloud. Naomi gave a slight nod, acknowledging the shift. "It was part of an ongoing investigation," she continued, her voice even, controlled. "One that did not involve me as a suspect." The officers exchanged brief glances, subtle, unspoken, their earlier certainty now replaced by a quiet awareness that they had stepped into something far more complex than they had been told. Hayes's grip tightened slightly around the flash drive, not in control, but in recognition of its significance. "Then who?" he asked, the question direct, but no longer commanding. Naomi held his gaze for a moment before answering, not with urgency, but with clarity. "Someone who understood how easily assumption becomes action," she said. "Someone who knew exactly how to redirect attention." The implication did not land loudly, but it landed fully. Hayes's eyes shifted again, not around the room this time, but inward, connecting the structure of the operation, the report that had triggered it, the speed with which it had been approved, and the absence of verification that now stood out with uncomfortable clarity. "This warrant," he said slowly, lifting the paper slightly as if seeing it for the first time, "it came through standard channels." Naomi's expression remained steady. "Standard does not mean accurate," she replied. "It means unchallenged." The room remained still, but the silence had changed again, no longer uncertain, but heavy with understanding. One of the officers near the doorway lowered his gaze, the shift subtle but visible, as if the weight of the moment had reached him as well. Hayes exhaled quietly, the breath leaving him slower this time, carrying with it the last fragments of the certainty he had walked in with. He looked at Naomi again, not as a subject of an operation, but as someone who had been standing in truth from the beginning. "You knew this would happen," he said, not accusing, but acknowledging. Naomi's eyes softened slightly, not with emotion, but with recognition of the path that had led here. "I knew it was possible," she said. "That is why everything was left where it could be seen." Hayes's gaze drifted once more to the frame on the wall, then back to the room, now understanding that nothing had been hidden because nothing needed to be. The truth had never been concealed. It had simply been overlooked. He lowered the warrant completely now, his hand relaxing as the paper folded against itself, no longer leading, no longer defining the moment. Around him, the officers stood in quiet awareness, the structure of command still present, but transformed by what had been revealed. And in that space, where assumption had once driven action, something else took its place, not force, not reaction, but the beginning of accountability, quiet and undeniable. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like something settling into its final place after a long imbalance. And in that quiet, every presence in the room adjusted without needing to be told. Hayes stood still for a moment longer, the flash drive in one hand, the folded warrant in the other, both objects now stripped of the authority they once carried, reduced instead to reminders of how easily power could move without clarity. He lowered both hands gradually, not in defeat, but in acceptance, the motion deliberate, controlled, as if acknowledging that the moment no longer belonged to him in the way it had when he entered. Around him, the officers began to step back, not hurried, not chaotic, but with a quiet awareness that their role had changed. A few exchanged brief glances, others avoided eye contact entirely, each one processing the shift in their own way, the earlier rhythm of coordinated action replaced by something more reflective, more restrained. Naomi remained where she had been from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, not claiming the room, but no longer needing to yield it. Hayes looked at her again, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but clear in a way that did not require words to explain what had been understood. "We are leaving," he said finally, his voice calm, not loud, but carrying enough weight to move the room without force. No one questioned it. No one needed clarification. The decision did not feel like a command, but like the only appropriate outcome left. One by one, the officers turned, retracing their steps, their movements quieter than before, more careful, as if aware of the space they were now exiting rather than controlling. The beam of a flashlight passed once more across the wall, this time lingering for just a second on the frame before lowering, not as a search, but as recognition. The door remained open, the night air drifting in faintly, carrying with it the distant hum of the city and the fading pulse of emergency lights outside. Hayes took a step toward it, then paused, turning back once more, not out of obligation, but because something remained unfinished. He met Naomi's eyes again, holding the look for a brief moment that carried more meaning than anything spoken earlier. "This should not have happened," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of formality, carrying something closer to accountability than apology. Naomi did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, not rejecting them, not accepting them fully, but acknowledging their place in the moment. "Then make sure it does not happen again," she said, her tone calm, grounded, not demanding, but clear. Hayes nodded once, a small, controlled motion, but one that held weight. He did not offer anything further. He turned and stepped out, crossing the threshold he had entered with certainty and now left with understanding. The officers followed, the sound of their footsteps fading gradually down the hallway, their presence dissolving into the night outside until the apartment was left with its original quiet, though it no longer felt the same. Naomi stood still for a moment after the last shadow disappeared, listening as the distant sounds softened, as the outside world resumed its rhythm without them. The door remained open for a few seconds longer before she stepped forward and closed it gently, the latch settling into place with a soft, final click. The apartment exhaled around her, the hum of the refrigerator returning to prominence, the faint tick of the clock marking time as it always had. She turned toward the hallway, her steps slow, measured, her presence returning to the space not as someone who had endured something, but as someone who had held her ground without losing herself. She paused briefly near the wall, her eyes resting once more on the frame, the identification still exactly where it had always been, unchanged, steady, unhidden. The truth had not moved. It had only been seen. Naomi took a quiet breath, then continued down the hallway, the soft light guiding her steps back toward the room where her mother rested, where care, patience, and quiet strength continued without interruption. And in the stillness that followed, nothing needed to be said, for the weight of what had passed to remain settled into the walls, into the air, into the silence that now